Hi, my name is Eric Moore. I am a PhD student in special education and teacher training at the University of Tennessee. I'm making this podcast today to help explore the concept of assessment in the classroom. I think that today's podcast will be relevant to teachers all the way from kindergarten through post-secondary programs. Really, what I want to focus on in assessment is this idea of empowering your students with assessment, and part of this means beginning with the end in mind. Let's take a closer look at this. When we talk about assessment, it's really important to define your terms. In fact, Aristotle is one of the first ones to explore the importance of definitions, all the way back in his Sophistical Refutations. Maybe that's not an exact quote, but here is an exact quote from a more recent text. Macmillan in 2014 wrote that it is essential that anyone who writes out or speaks about assessment defines it at the outset. And one of the reasons for this is that assessment covers such a huge variety of tasks and can be used in the classroom or for teachers themselves, for summative or formative assessments, for many different applications. One way that I like to think about it is as a continuum of formality. For example, if you were to organize these different things that we think of as classroom assessments along this continuum of formality, it becomes quite clear that we mean something very different when we talk about classroom discussion than we do when we talk about standardized assessments, such as state standardized tests or graduation requirement test, that sort of thing. So there's this huge continuum of formality. On the far right, we're referring to things typically as summative. This simply means that these are assessments that occur at the end of a learning experience. These are oftentimes called graded or serious stuff, kid. On the far other side, we have more formative assessments, assessments that are designed to help enhance the learning process by informing the student and the teacher, for example, of what learning has occurred and needs yet to occur. This is often on the fly or just to relax, everyone breathe. Now, Aristotle will be the first to point out that there's a lot of jargon here. But in today's podcast, I don't really want to talk about all of this. What I'm really interested in is the more formal material, the summative assessments. So let's look at those specifically. When we talk about summative assessments, we're talking about those that are formally assessed, often cumulative of a unit, and comparatively high stress. In order to help develop our students' potential to master these summative assessments, I think it's important that we begin with the end in mind and that we empower our students. Notice that these two things roughly correspond with the three features of summative assessments. Let's talk about this first one first, beginning with the end in mind. This essentially means that when I'm going to give an assessment, before I even begin the unit itself, I want to begin with an understanding of what the objectives or skills are that I want the students to know. This is the very first step in beginning with the end in mind, or backwards planning. Once I know what the students are to learn, then I can determine an appropriate assessment that matches what I want them to learn. For example, if I wanted my students to be able to demonstrate understanding of a skill, then a good assessment type would not be something like a multiple choice test, which demonstrates knowledge but not application or understanding. I want to make sure that my assessment matches the objective or skill that I've already determined. A really important thing then is to add a good rubric to that assessment. And finally, the learning activities are the last thing that I develop once I know exactly what those learning activities are going towards an assessment that will effectively demonstrate whether the students have achieved the objective or skills that I sought out to teach. And so we begin the lesson before any of that, and we work our way through now going forward, even though our planning was actually backwards. This is oftentimes referred to as understanding by design or as backwards planning. I know, Aristotle, more jargon. Anyway, these rubrics are going to be so important that I actually want to come back to those. Let's bring them down and we'll talk about those more in a moment here. So that's the idea of beginning with the end in mind. What about empowering our students? Yep, we're going to come back to those rubrics. Well, I want you to imagine that I set a trash basket at the front of the classroom and I call up 2 volunteers and I give each of them 3 wads of paper and tell them to shoot them into the basket, that I'm going to grade them on their performance. The first performer goes like this, and they shoot 3 times, and they make all 3 shots. And I give them a score, 30%. The student is dumbfounded. Why did they get 30%? They made all 3 shots. I wave them away and bring in the second student. The second student goes through a certain warm-up procedure and shoots the shots like this. This student only made one of them, as you can see, but amazingly, they score 80%. Both students are confused. The first student is frustrated, and the second student is incredulous that she was able to get such a high score despite what she thought was a poor performance. In both cases, the students are disempowered. It feels like the teacher is arbitrarily assigning them a score that they don't understand how they got, and they have no idea how they're going to get it again. This is where rubrics are so important, and it's so important to provide rubrics before assessing. For example, in this case, what I was looking for was that the student warmed up before shooting, announced their shot, followed through with their hand and wrist, and finally making the shot was actually only a small percentage of the score. So it so happened that the first student, though he made all 3 shots, didn't do the first 3 things on the rubric. The second student, who only made one of the shots, nonetheless did the 3 things that were weighed significantly heavier on the rubric. Had the students known what was on the rubric ahead of time, they would have been significantly empowered. But having a good rubric isn't the only thing that we need to do to empower our students. The system, some people feel, is already stacked against our students, like this comic famously represents. It says, "For a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb this tree." Now this comic is obviously making fun of our education system with our standardized testing and recognizing that all of our students are significantly different. So even if the test is standardized, it doesn't mean that it's an equal opportunity for everyone. How can we avoid falling into this pitfall in our own classes? Even if we can't change the mandates of standardized testing, are we doing the same thing when we assign summative assessments in our own classrooms that we do have control over? And more importantly then, what can we do to avoid that? Well, one solution for this might be the idea of universal design for learning. Let me show you a brief introductory video about this. Hi, my name is Eric Moore. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee, and I love UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And I'm all about supporting it and helping other teachers develop their ability and knowledge in UDL as well. Today I want to share with you just a brief idea for a practice of UDL and why you would use this. Let's say that you're a science teacher and you're teaching a unit on deforestation, and you want your students ultimately to understand the causes and results of deforestation in our world today. Let's say that up until now, whenever you taught this unit, you've concluded the unit with an essay in which the students are supposed to do research and present their response to that question in an essay form. My question, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, when we grade those essays, are we grading the students' understanding of deforestation causes and impact the way that we intended to assess, or are we assessing their knowledge of those things and their ability to write an essay? And is the ability to write an essay really a relevant central skill to my science class, my biology class? Is it important for my students to be able to write essays in order for them to understand biology? If it's not, then maybe we need to rethink how we're going to assess the students. If we're ultimately interested in whether they understand the concepts, then I want to make sure that a student who understands the concepts is given an opportunity to prove to me that they understand the concepts. And maybe a student who happens to be a poor essayist is going to do poorly, even though she actually understands the concepts at hand. Well, this is where universal design for learning can come in. One of the principles of universal design for learning is that of providing options for action and expression for my students. In this case, what that might mean is when it comes time to assess the student's understanding of deforestation, I can say, you may write an essay to show your understanding, but you may also choose to do a video or make a model and summarize that model for me, or do a live presentation for the class, or make a keynote or something, giving them these options so that whatever their skill set is in demonstrating their understanding, they can utilize that skill set to show me what they've learned. This is great because then it puts the decision making of what am I good at, how can I show this in the student's hand. It empowers the students to choose the method that's going to best prove what they understood. Think about this from a student's perspective. If I really understand deforestation, I want to be a biologist, I want to be a scientist, but I'm just not a great essayist yet, how frustrating would it be to not be able to articulate my ideas and get a poor score, even though I really understand the topic. Now with this opportunity, maybe I would as a student go ahead and make a video, and I can present thoroughly with visual aids the concepts. I get it, and my teacher gets to see that I get it. I get a good grade. The teacher has a better understanding of the degree to which the lessons were successful for me. It's a win-win situation. This idea, again, is a principle of UDL of providing multiple means of action and expression, giving the students options so that they can become expert learners, and so that I can be more accurately informed about whether in fact they have learned. See you next time. When we're talking about UDL, there's more to it than what I was just representing. That's just focused on assessment, which is what this podcast is ultimately about. But if you want to understand a broader perspective of UDL, UDL is basically based on brain-based research, exploring networked regions of the brain and how they relate to learning. It explores three specific networks: a recognition network, which deals with the what of learning, the strategic network, which deals with the how of learning, and the affective network, which deals with the why of learning. Those who are the developers of UDL suggest that all three of these networks must work in tangent for effective learning to occur. In fact, they offer guidelines for how these different areas of the brain can be activated in good instruction. For example, providing multiple means of representation, providing multiple means of action and expression, and providing multiple means of engagement. And they provide several different ways to approach this for the different domains, which ultimately result in a focus on the student. We want students to be resourceful, knowledgeable learners. We want them to be strategic, goal-oriented learners, and we want them to be purposeful, motivated learners. UDL is all about empowering and enabling our students. If you want more information about this, you can check out my source, cast.org. That's the Center for Applied Special Technology. So in summary, we talked about summative assessment as ways to approach it by beginning with the end in mind and by empowering students. We suggested that when we talk about beginning with the end in mind, don't just end the unit at a summative assessment, but plan to end the unit there. Start with your goal in mind and understand how you're going to see that the students have achieved the goal, and then plan learning activities that are going to get them there. The second part was about empowering our students. We talked about two strategies for this: providing clear, age and ability appropriate rubrics, and teach your students how to use it. And provide multiple means and options for your students to show their learning. When you do all of this, I feel that this is the greatest way that we can make sure that our students who are taking summative assessments are prepared so that we can validly and effectively assess their progress. And if we're not doing that, then what is the point of teaching? How have you seen these practices in your placements? Leave a note.